Hello, boys and girls. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the packet for week 2. I'm going to talk about the pages that are in the middle. That you're going to be doing some adding and subtracting of fractions, and then you're going to be doing some dividing of fractions. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to do each of those so that we don't get them mixed up, because sometimes they're easy to get confused. So the first thing we're going to talk about is adding fractions. Okay, so we know when we add fractions, you have to have a common denominator. So if you're adding a fraction like 1/3 plus 1/3, that's easy because the denominator stays the same and you just add the numerators. That's the rule for adding fractions. Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes the denominators are not the same. Okay, so you might have 1/2 plus 2/5. Okay, and then you have to think to yourself, well, what is 1/2? How can I add 1/2 to 2/5 when they don't have the same denominator? Okay, so, well, one of the things you can do is think about the fact that if you have 1/2, okay, and you want to make it into smaller pieces, okay, like in this case, I could take my 1/2 and break it into smaller pieces so that I have tenths. Well, I can see that 1/2 is the same as 5/10, right? So I can change the fraction to another fraction that's equivalent. Okay, so you can see that's the way it looks and that's the way it is. So over here, when I get to this problem, I can say to myself, well, what number does 2 and 5 have in common as a multiple? Well, 2 is, if I count by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. If I count by 5s, 5, 10, 15. Oh, I can see that they both have a common multiple of 10. Okay, and then I can say, oh, I'm going to make a denominator of 10. All right, so if I'm using a denominator of 10, I have to ask myself, what did I do to the 2 to make it a 10? Well, what I did was I multiplied by 5, right? So if I multiply the bottom by 5, I have to multiply the top by 5, because 5/5 equals 1. And when you multiply by 1, you haven't changed the value of the problem at all. You've just changed the way it looks. So 1 times 5 is 5, 2 times 5 is 10. So 1/2 and 5/10 are equivalent fractions. Okay, and then same thing down here. I'm going to multiply by 2/2, which is the same as 1, and I end up with 4/10. So I have two equivalent fractions that I'm adding together, but now they have a common denominator, and my answer is 9/10. Okay, so I might do something similar with another addition problem, like 1/6 and let's say 3/4. Okay, if I'm adding those together, again, I might think of my multiples. 6, 12, 18, excuse me, 24, like that, and then count by 4, 8, 12. Oh, I see 12 is the common factor, excuse me, common multiple. So I'm going to use 12 as my common denominator. Now, if I wanted to, I could just multiply the 6 and the 4 and use 24 as my common denominator, right? But if I use 12, I have a smaller fraction. It's a little bit easier. I don't have as much reducing to do or simplifying. So what did I do to the 6 to make it 12? I multiplied by 2, which means I multiply the numerator by 2. Okay, what do I do with the denominator? I multiplied it by 3 so to get 12, so I'm multiplying the numerator by 3, and I get 9/12. So 2/12 plus 9/12 equals 11/12. Okay, so similarly, when I am subtracting, I need to also have a common denominator. So if I have a problem that where I'm subtracting fractions, I might do something like, if I have 1/2 minus, let's say, 2/7. Okay, I could over here count by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 7, 14. So those are my multiples, right? And I can see that 14 and 14 are both multiples of 2 and 7. Okay, or I could have just multiplied the denominators and known, okay, I can use 14. There's a lot of ways you could do it. You could do it in your head, most of you. Okay, so what did I do to the 2 to make it 14? I multiplied by 7. Okay, so I end up with 7/7 because I have to do whatever I do the bottom, I have to do the top. Down here I multiply by 2, so I have to multiply by 2 on the top, so I end up with 4/14. So, sorry, so I have 7/14 minus 4/14, which equals 3/14. Okay, so that's how I'm going to be subtracting fractions, by using a common denominator. I'm going to do it one more time. Let's see. Well, I'm going to use a number that they give us. So how about we do 1/6? I'm going to change it a little bit, minus 3/5. Okay, so the common denominator between 6 and 5, the only thing I can think of, the smallest thing I can think of, is 30. Okay, so I'm going to multiply this by 5, which means I'm multiplying the top by 5, so I get 5/30. And here I'm going to multiply the bottom by 6, which means I'm going to multiply the top by 6. Oops, I didn't do a very good job creating this. That's not going to work. I'm not sure what I was thinking there. I guess this should be an addition. Let's pretend we're adding here. 18 30ths. So we're going to add these because I can't subtract them because I picked bad fractions. And I'm going to add those up then and get 18 plus 5 is 23/30. Okay, so similarly, if I were to do something like a subtraction problem, I could have 5/7 minus 2/6. Okay, and then I would find a common denominator, and in this case, I think the only common denominator is going to be 42. Okay, so I'm going to multiply this by 6 and this by 6 and get 30. Multiply this by 7 and this by 7 and get 14. And now I can subtract. And I end up with 16/42s. Okay. And then I will need to simplify that because they're both even numbers. Okay, and if I cut them both in half, I get 8/21s. And that would be my answer. Okay, so that's adding and subtracting fractions. Now I'm going to move on to multiplying and dividing fractions. So we are going to be dividing fractions today in the packet, but in order to divide fractions, you do need to know how to multiply them. So if I have 1/4 times 2/3, all I have to do is multiply the numerators. 1 times 2 is 2. In the denominators, 2 times 3 is 12. And I get 2/12, which I can then simplify because I can divide the top and bottom by 2, and I get 1/6. Okay? So just like when you have an equivalent fraction and you're trying to find a common denominator, you multiply the top and bottom by a fraction that has the same number on top and bottom, which equals 1. When you divide by 2/2, that is also 1. You're not changing the value, you're just changing the way the fraction looks. Okay, now if I had this problem and I wanted to cross cancel before I started multiplying, I could do that. I could simplify the problem by looking at these two numbers. Anything that's on the top can be cross canceled with anything on the bottom if they share a factor. Okay, well 2 can be divided by 2 and it equals 1, and 4 can be divided by 2 and it equals 2. Okay, so when I multiply those across, 1 times 1 is 1 and 2 times 3 is 6. I get the same answer as I did before. Okay, that's the answer. But I didn't have to simplify because I simplified first. Okay, so you can choose to do that when you're multiplying fractions. So dividing fractions is basically you have to use your knowledge of multiplying fractions. Okay, because we are not going to divide a fraction. It's very complicated. We can draw diagrams of it, which we did in Eureka Math. But in order for you to do the algorithm, what you're going to do is you're going to keep the very first fraction the same. It's the same fraction. It's in the same place. It doesn't move. Then I'm going to do the opposite of division. I'm going to multiply. But I can't just decide, oh, I'm going to multiply these two fractions and get the same answer as division. No, that doesn't work because then you get a completely different answer. But if you multiply and then you flip the other fraction over, then you actually are back to where you started again. It just looks different. Okay, so you can multiply the reciprocal. Okay, and when we multiply the reciprocal, 1 times 3 is 3, 4 times 2 is 8, and we end up with 3/8. Okay, so multiplying the reciprocal is how we're going to divide fractions. I'm going to show you another example. So if my problem was 2/5 and we're dividing by, let's say, I don't know, 3/15. Okay, so I keep this fraction the same. I don't change it, I don't move it. It has to stay in the same place and it has to be the exact same fraction. I change division to multiplying and I write the reciprocal of the second fraction. Okay, now I can go ahead and multiply this across, but if I choose to, just like in multiplication, I could choose to cross cancel. So I see that there's a 15 and a 5 here. So I can cross cancel and say, oh, I know 15 divided by 5 is 3, and 5 divided by 5 is 1. Now my problem's simpler, and I can multiply. 2 times 3 is 6. 1 times 3 is 3. Okay, and now I have 6/3, and I end up with 2. Okay, now if I wanted to, I could have even simplified this and realized that 3/3 actually is 1. So 2/1 times 1 is just 2. Okay, but it doesn't matter. There's lots of ways you can simplify. So you can simplify before you multiply. You can simplify after you multiply. Okay, the key is always write your answer in simplest form. Okay, so whatever method you like to use to get to that point is fine with me. Okay, so I'm going to do one more. 3/8 divided by, let's say, 1/2. Okay, so I'm keeping the first fraction the same. I'm multiplying the reciprocal. I'm seeing here that I can cross cancel. Okay, so 2 goes into 2 once, 2 goes into 8 4 times. When I multiply across, I get 3/4, and that is my answer. Okay, now I know some people, last time we did this problem that had like this page that had problems on them, puzzle on it, so I'm going to explain it. So the first problem on number 1, we're going to multiply the reciprocal, which equals 4/3, which is the same as 1 1/3. Okay, now I'm not sure how they're going to write it over here. They might write it as 4/3, but as my answer, nope, that's good. So as my answer for number 1, I write 1 1/3, and then I look over in this box and look for the answer 1 1/3. Oh, there it is. That's the letter I. So I'm going to write the letter I here. So everywhere that I see the letter I on this page, I'm going to color in dark brown. Okay, so everywhere I look that I can, and if it's just light brown, because that's what you have, that's fine. But see how I did that? I put the answer to number 1 here. I found out what letter equaled 1 1/3. I put it in this spot here, and then I know what color to color all of the I's down below. This will make a picture, the mystery picture. So this should probably get you through the first 3 or 4 days of math, okay, for week 2. All right, we will talk again soon. Thanks. Bye.